Total Drama is one of those shows with a shocking amount of episodes, with a total number totaling over 122-minute endeavors. As with more content coming, now seems like the perfect time to look back on the series. In this first video, I'm going to be reviewing every episode of the first season, giving them a score, and then talking about the season in general at the end. Anyway, we have 26 episodes and a special to cover, so let's go ahead and get started with every episode of Total Drama Island reviewed. Episode 1, Not So Happy Campers, Part 1. The campers arrive and learn that instead of chilling in a gorgeous mansion, they'll be spending the next 8 weeks on dingy old Camp Wawanakwa. The series opens up with the now iconic Chris McClain opening. It's nothing special on its own, but together it more or less captures the vibe of the series, and of Chris's character. That's actually something that will continue throughout this episode and into the character introductions. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but the actual introductions and the character interactions that follow are actually pretty stellar at explaining these characters. The special emphasis on Ezekiel is cool, and the beginning of some character dynamics is nice too. It's a long scene, one that takes on most of the episode, but it's pretty good nevertheless. The scene of the dock is really nice and transitions well into picking the teams. Again, without much knowledge of the characters this early in the season, there's not much to get out of this. Moving forward, the jokes in this episode are restricted to purely one-liners and visual gags as a result of unfamiliar characters, which, while limiting, still allows for some great jokes like this one.
Communal bathrooms? But I'm not Catholic.
The best example of characterization in this episode, in my opinion, is actually the most subtle, with the cockroach scene. It only really sets up Lindsay and Tyler, but small moments help other characters too. Finally, the introduction to Chef is pretty mediocre, but the lead into the next episode is done well, leaning pretty heavily into the Survivor parody aspect of the series. Overall, this episode is quite limited in how good it could be as a result of the gargantuan task of introducing 24 characters. Still, it hit that limit, introducing the characters well while still having some good gags. Episode 2, Not So Happy Campers, Part 2. The campers must jump off an insanely high cliff under shark-infested waters, then carry a cartload of materials back to the campgrounds and build a hot tub from scratch. Picking up where the last one left off, this episode also continues the trend of characterization through each character's cliff jump. The jokes during the jumps are funny enough, and the team switch, while effectively pointless, isn't overdramatized. The characters who chose not to jump make sense, and while incredibly cheesy, the Heather-Lashana confrontation sets up Heather well as the antagonist of the season. Owen's jump is probably the comedic highlight of the episode, and it leads well into the second half. The episode does a fantastic job in presenting the Gophers as a well-rounded team, and the Bass as a dysfunctional one, as Katie, Sadie, and Courtney all have somewhat comedic issues on the walk back to camp. Heather's faux apology works well, and her friendship with Lindsay being set up is nice, even if it isn't officially an alliance until the next episode. Ezekiel's sexist plotline makes enough sense, as they really didn't have enough time to fully set up an elimination this episode. I would have appreciated if it wasn't so late or so abrupt, but they make up a quick reason to eliminate someone, and it works pretty well. The campfire is perfectly overdramatic, and while seeing the series multiple times, like I have, dampens the effect a little bit, the first elimination is handled pretty well. Overall, another pretty great introduction episode. The characterization continues to excel, the gags are still funny, but Zeke's downfall is too immediate, and Courtney's end monologue ends up going nowhere this season. Episode 3, The Big Sleep. The campers face off in an epic awake-a-thon. While definitely still having an early series vibe, this episode is the first in the series to follow the show's regular format. This one really serves two purposes, to set up Gwen and Trent, and to set up Heather and her alliance. We'll get to those later, but first let's talk about the first two challenges. Besides some nice jokes, they mainly just exist as throwaways, leading into the main one. Owen is the butt of most of the jokes this episode, no pun intended, and while all of these are funny on their own, they persist throughout the entirety of the episode, and towards the end they become quite predictable. Anyway, into the main purposes of this episode as mentioned before, the Gwen-Trent thing is, well, just not good. It's incredibly boring, persistently cheesy, and Trent especially could not possibly be a less entertaining character. The whole episode is honestly a bit boring in the middle, partially by design. What's not boring, however, is Heather in this one. Heather truly begins her reign as the season's villain in this episode by establishing her alliance and causing her first elimination. Her ending confessional is easily the highlight of the episode, fully stating her intentions of being the villain. Anyway, I kinda slipped it in here, but Eva is more or less used this episode as a vessel for Heather's story. Not every character's elimination has to be purely about them, especially this early in the series, and despite Chris's warning, Eva will have her chance again this season, so I really don't have a problem with it. But yeah, this episode is definitely the weakest so far, mostly as a result of the excruciatingly boring Gwen-Trent stuff. Still, due to some clever jokes and a really nice Heather plot, this episode is still pretty good. Episode 4, Dodgebrawl. The campers face off in a classic schoolyard bloodbath. Welcome to the Duncan and Harold episode with a touch of Owen and Noah to go around. The continuity from last episode is nice to see, and the Harold stuff, while a bit longer than necessary, necessary, still works pretty well to set up his arc for the episode. Into the actual dodgeball portion of this one, it's a little hit or miss. To start, the game doesn't ever really make sense. The game pauses seemingly at random, the numbers never match up, and the concept of sitting out never begins to make sense. However, it is also filled with great moments for underutilized characters like Cody, and is filled with some great one-liners.
How does it feel to suck so much?
Not very good.
Noah's downfall is handled somewhat well, although it's yet again another character being eliminated without much screen time. At least they do set it up towards the beginning of the episode. Moving forward, the Tyler Lindsay stuff continues to be mediocre, and Duncan finally gets his chance in the limelight. Duncan being good at dodgeball fits his character, and the piano-backed montage is one of the best scenes this time around. The Harold stuff at the end is a little out of nowhere, and it's probably a little bit excessive in addition to the next episode, but it gives a nice underdog story to end it on. Noah not realizing he was going to be sent home is weird for a character that's usually pretty intelligent, and as Chris mentions, the entire ceremony this time around is pretty lackluster. But yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a funny, action-packed episode with great character moments, but it's sometimes hard to get around the more boring stuff like the Lindsay Tyler thing, as well as the game making little to no sense. Episode 5, Not Quite Famous. The campers step on stage for the most dramatic elimination competition yet. Do you like the character dynamics of the Big Sleep? Well, this episode once again focuses on Gwen and Trent as well as Heather Filney. However, unlike the Big Sleep, this episode is set on a much more interesting challenge, a talent contest. Most of the time in between the setup and the contest is filled with characters showcasing their talents. Owen's, Izzy's, and Beth's are probably the best ones at characterization, but they're all pretty entertaining. I honestly also feel like this is a good Bridget and Courtney episode. Bridget actually has a role, and her clumsiness fits her character pretty well. Courtney, on the other hand, is able to differentiate herself from Heather. Courtney and Heather both establish themselves as the leader of their respective teams early in the series, but Courtney's more reasonable and friendly attitude, while still being too competitive, definitely shines through in this episode. One more thing before getting to the actual talent show is the Tyler Lindsay stuff, which basically exists just to drive the idea of Heather being annoyed with it. Anyway, into the actual talent competition, DJ and Justin's exist just to fill space, and Trent's is nice and short. Into the actual important ones, I definitely feel like there was a better way to handle Bridget. Like, I get that she needed to fail, but it's just unpleasant and unfunny in my opinion. Generally, I dislike gross out moments, but there's a somewhat decent way to do them that's not this. Heather's reading is remarkably cold-blooded and a fantastic moment for the character. Everyone's shocked at just how awful it really is sells it as a turning point for Heather and Gwen's feud. Finally, Harold beatboxing is one of the most iconic scenes from the show for a reason. It fits his character, it's actually good beatboxing, and the constant zoom in on Harold's face allows the joke to continue to get funnier as it gets longer. Harold saving the day in back-to-back episodes is a bit odd though. Justin's elimination, an episode where he didn't speak, is also surprisingly handled well, and I even liked Heather spoiling the outcome. Justin is more gimmicky than anyone this season, so his elimination being quick and serving someone else's storyline works. Anyway, this episode is pretty great. The only real complaint I have is Bridget's puke fest, but besides that, yeah, this episode utilizes characters well, has some great gags, and sets up or continues various season arcs. Episode 6, The Sucky Outdoors. An overnight camping trip into the woods brings out the crazy in Izzy. In a trend that seems to be forming early in the series, the challenge of this episode also makes little sense. So the idea is to be back as early as possible. Obviously you can't just show up in the middle of the night, so I guess it was first back after sunrise, but how do you possibly police that? Truthfully, the challenge again just serves as the backdrop for the three stories of the episode: the Bass, the Gophers, and the BFFs. Let's start first with Katie and Sadie's subplot. It sucks. Moving on. Okay, fine, I'll talk about it a tiny bit more. Two characters without character arguing over something that no one cares about makes for a horrible time. It's just a drag seeing them mention events we've never seen, all while seemingly being void of jokes. Moving forward, the Gophers plot mainly revolves around Owen and Izzy. Their relationship more or less begins here, and it's a nice moment for both of them. Both of their mistakes fit their character, and the rest of the Bears plot is filled with great jokes, my favorite of which being Cody's uncontrollable bladder. The animation during Owen's story looks nice too. Moving on to the last plot, the Killer Bass have the least screen time this episode. It's definitely the C plot, with the only real focus being Courtney and Duncan. They're handled pretty well, and the campfire story bit of the plot works as a nice centerpiece. Finally, the ending is about as you would expect, as the Katie-Sadie plot gets to drag on even further. Again, I really don't care about either of them, and I think that eliminating them both at the same time would have been better. The small moment between Courtney and Duncan is nice at the end though. In general, this episode has strong moments and jokes, but the focus on the BFF BFFs is nearly intolerable, and the challenge fails to provide any structure. The weakest episode are the first 6. Episode 7, Phobia Factor. Each camper is forced to face his or her worst fear. So the premise of this episode is one of the best of the season. For starters, seeing the teams somewhat friendly with one another is nice to see. In addition, it feels like an episode from earlier in the season, where each character is given something that characterizes them, this time being their fear. Some of these make sense, like Beth and Lindsay's, while others exist purely for comedic effect, like Jeff or Duncan's. Either way, these fears are impeccably creative and add a lot of comedy to the episode. Another weird thing in this one is a lack of focus on any particular character besides Courtney. Gwen and Trent get a moment with no resolution, and Heather doesn't even have any lines. It's definitely a strange episode formatically, but I still really like it. Well, most of it. The first 17 minutes of the episode are nearly perfect, besides the inconsistency in the challenges. Whether or not the contestant had to deal with their fears or just face them changes from camper to camper, despite what Chris says. For example, Chris said Trent had to talk to the mime, but he still gets a point for jumping in the lake. In contrast, Harold just has to fight ninjas, which he does, but he still doesn't earn a point. Still, as long as you mostly ignore the fact that this is a scored challenge, the first part of the episode is pretty stellar. But then you get to the last 5 minutes where the episode goes straight off a hill. First off, Tyler's challenge is another example of a camper completing their challenge, staying in the pen, and not getting the point anyway. Whatever though, as we move to Courtney's challenge. Obviously she wasn't going to complete it, and this would cause her to catch some flack, but did they seriously have to offer her bonus points? Like, just by reversing Jeff, Harold, and Trent's outcome, which they should do anyway, that would have closed the gap and made Courtney the deciding camper anyway. But the real atrocity of this episode is Tyler's elimination. Tyler barely talks in this episode, and there's no explanation of why he got the vote instead of Courtney. It could be more or less assumed that DJ and Jeff were friends with Duncan already, and that Duncan persuaded them to vote off Tyler, but that's a big presumption with little evidence. So yeah, Tyler not even saying anything after he's eliminated almost feels like the voice actor couldn't be bothered to show up. Still, the elimination is more or less a cop-out, but the rest of the episode is pretty fantastic. With funny jokes, great characterization, and a really clever challenge, this funky episode turns out pretty good. Episode 8, Up the Creek. The campers participate in a 3-part canoe race to Boney Island. Just like the last one, this episode also feels weird for the season, having no Duncan or Heather throughout. Instead, we get some focus on some neglected characters, as well as even more Gwen and Trent. Pretty simple challenge set up here, and the Beth thing is hidden pretty well at the beginning as just a gag. Quickly after the introduction, we get to the funniest part of the episode, Cody. Cody is just hilarious throughout this entire episode, and his crush on Gwen is portrayed as well as conceivably possible. The cuts between Gwen and Cody's confessional is a surprisingly well-timed gag, and the blunt approach adds to the comedic effect. Similarly, ending his chances with Gwen before the 10-minute mark was honestly the best way to handle it, and I'm very surprised that they did. I'll get back to the resolution of the storyline later, but first let's talk about the other story of this episode, Jeff and Bridget. And yeah, this one is fantastic too. Both of them describing Jeff's gift at the same time works really well, and DJ and Courtney are great supporting characters this time around. Finally, the last subplot is Izzy shenanigans, which yeah, are Izzy shenanigans. They don't overstay their welcome, and most of her lines end up being funny. So yeah, all 3 plots here work really well. To complement this episode even more, the gags throughout are some of the funniest of the season. Cody's Indiana Jones fumble, Courtney trying to leave Jeff, and Harold immediately throwing the paddles in the fire are all just fantastic visual jokes. The actual challenge plot of the episode ends up being completely pointless, but who cares about some stinky challenge? The characters are all that matters this time around, which takes us to the ending. Izzy's quasi-elimination is a funny bit with a great shot of confused characters, and it works really well to get rid of the crazy camper. Cody winning his bet is a nice moment that shows some actual character growth, although it's a little bit shortchanged by the next episode. Gwen and Trent, along with Jeff and Bridget, have nice moments that propel their relationships, and the tease with Beth works well as a mini arc for her. It's a fantastic episode that excels at both the comedic side of the show and the more character dynamics driven arc side. Episode 9, Paintball Deer Hunter. The campers are split into deer and hunters, and each one of them has to go out and bag as many of the other team's deer as possible. The setup for this episode makes it obvious what it's about, Beth's separation from her alliance. Making Beth just slightly smarter and less gullible from Lindsay finally pays off in this episode, as she gets to be more of a character than ever before. More on that later. Let's first talk about the actual challenge, which is fine. Really the only plot to take advantage of it is Owen's, which, while funny at first, quickly devolves into fart jokes and fat jokes. Speaking of somewhat funny jokes in this episode, while I don't particularly like Cody's elimination later in this episode, which I'll get to later in this review, I do really like him being in a cast in the confessionals before he actually gets mauled. It's a nice touch that adds just a bit of comedy to a pretty boring episode. Besides these 2 small subplots and the hilarious but short Duncan Courtney stuff, most of this episode revolves around the alliance. And yeah, it's not terrible, but also not terribly interesting. Lindsay barely has anything to do this episode, so it's basically 10 minutes of Beth saying no and Heather being shocked. While it does have some accidental comedy,
Take back what? The N-word.
The gophers shooting each other with paintballs isn't nearly as fun as the show intends it to be. Anyway, the challenge more or less just ends as we move into the elimination, which is handled pretty poorly. I get that Heather couldn't be eliminated, but having Owen and Lashana both vote Cody over her is incredibly uncharacteristic for both of them. Similarly, either Trent or Gwen also had to have voted Cody, so it ends up just being some incredible plot convenience that he gets sent home. Honestly, this could have easily been fixed by Chris just eliminating Cody himself because of his injuries, but whatever. This episode certainly isn't terrible, having some funny jokes and subplots, but the main plot is simultaneously boring and frustrating, and the elimination is shoehorned just to keep Beth and Heather around. Episode 10, If You Can't Take the Heat. The two teams must make a 3-course meal for judgment. A cooking challenge may seem like one of the more mundane challenges in the series, but no, wait, that's actually true. Really, this is more of a vessel for team collapse on both sides. Starting with the Bass, besides some quick moments from both Bass couples, both of which are somehow still funny, most of the focus is put on the feud between Harold and his fellow male cabin mates. This part of the plot isn't necessarily interesting, and while I do particularly applaud the episode for not doing the obvious and making the underwear not actually Harold's, it's still mostly just to give the Bass something to do. Meanwhile, the Gophers' collapse is way more interesting. Owen's pain plot is not exactly worth commenting on, although I do find issue with him eating the ribs at the end. Owen's level of obsession with food is always changing based on the episode, but it really goes too far this time. But obviously, the main plot of the episode is the feud between Lindsay, Beth, Heather, and Lashana. Lashana kinda butts into the plot just to move it along, but it works pretty well. Heather as the leader of the Gophers definitely comes off as toxic as the show intends, and it works pretty well that way. Beth is still too shy to carry a feud by herself, so Lashana makes it more of a fair fight. The feud uses the challenge background well to set up key moments throughout, the best example being Lindsay's betrayal. While it does come out of nowhere, it sets up a key moment in Lindsay's arc of not being a complete pushover. Also, seeing Heather come out of the freezer is definitely the highlight of the episode. As I mentioned before, the actual end of the challenge is pretty weak, as they make it a lot closer for drama's sake than the actual events of the episode would lead you to believe. Finally, the elimination is another seemingly plot armor charged one, as you are forced to believe that Lindsay turned her back on Beth, and that either Trent or Lashana values superstition over getting rid of Heather. But I digress. Beth's arc had gotten as far as it could this season, so her departure isn't exactly tragic. So yeah, this episode certainly isn't terrible, but it really doesn't have any plot or moments that transform it into something better. The only redeemable part of the episode is the relationship stuff on the Bass side, but that's really restricted to one moment each, leaving the rest of the episode stranded. Episode 11, Who Can You Trust? Given the growing tensions on both teams, what better way to mess with the campers than forcing them to trust one another? One thing the first 10 episodes of the series all excelled at was building up the inter-team feuds on both sides, and in this episode all of that comes to a head, at least for the Gophers. Yeah, really the main disgruntlement within the Bass, Harold and the other guys, is more or less unmentioned as we once again focus on Heather. Reviewing this episode really works best if you go challenge by challenge, so let's start with the rock climbing. Gwen getting exposed by Heather works well enough, although they never really expand on the consequences of that. Seriously, Gwen doesn't even speak to Heather for the rest of the episode, leaving this moment as no more than a gag. Speaking of gags, DJ and Duncan slamming into each other is the highlight of the segment. Moving on, the pufferfish stuff has some kind of funny moments from the Gopher side of things, but the main focus is obviously on Jeff and Bridget. Regarding them, their relationship is basically created out of thin air, but their moment is still pretty nice, I guess. The bunny plot is basically only relevant for Duncan, so I'll get to that later. Continuing on, barring some remarkably average physical comedy, the William Tell stuff is basically only a show of justification for getting rid of Sadie. It makes sense for the show to give Sadie an independence arc after Katie's elimination, but she more or less just sits in the background until this episode. Whatever, the show is already full as is, so I guess there's no time for more Sadie stuff. The trapeze part somehow takes the cake this episode for uselessness to the plot, with its only real significance being Heather getting what she deserves. My favorite joke in this episode has to be the gradual decline of healthy campers throughout. Seriously, just watching the numbers dwindle is hilarious. The blind toboggan race is probably the most fun idea of this episode, and it does capitalize with some fun visual gags. While a bit cheap, I find DJ technically costing the team his challenge to be a nice way to give the Bass a moral win, but still eliminate Sadie. Duncan's moment of kindness was sorely needed in order to make him more of a character, and it works pretty well. I wish he and Courtney had a longer moment at the end, but they get there as in the next episode. Finally, the Sadie-Katie reunion feels a bit too nice for this show. Like, this is the show that nearly drowned a disfigured Cody a few episodes ago, and now they're giving a background character a heartwarming moment? Weird. Anyway, this episode had great potential to be a fantastic character-driven episode, but instead falls in the category of funny gags, weak episode. The Duncan stuff is neat, but a lot of the challenges fail to have a purpose. Episode 12, Basics Training. The 12 remaining campers are sent to an insane boot camp. Chef's replacement as the host of the episode actually works surprisingly well. Well, Chef's personality would likely become very tiring if it was there throughout the entire series, but just for one episode, it really works. What doesn't really work is the male killer bass torturing Harold throughout this episode. While I get that it was necessary for the ending, which, trust me, we'll talk about later, it feels overly cruel for Jeff and even a little for Duncan. The challenges of the episode are pretty dull, except for one obvious exception. The thriller parody is one of the most iconic scenes of the show, and for good reason. It's hilarious. It might have been a bit funnier if they led into it a bit, but yeah, it still works pretty well. Speaking of things working really well, Duncan and Courtney have their best episode of the season. Duncan constantly getting in trouble with Chef obviously fits his character, and it works really well as a reason to eventually separate him and Courtney. Their dialogue in the boathouse and during their mission to steal food is written really well, as well as Courtney getting all messed up afterwards. I honestly just really like how Courtney has done this episode, giving her meaningful change while not ultimately sacrificing her character. I'll get to the last section of the episode in a second, but I really quickly want to touch on the physical comedy of this episode. Especially within the obstacle course, this excels, with Owen and Lashana both having great moments. I also like all the campers from both teams relaxing in the cabin before the finale. Anyway, the final challenge ends the challenge portion of the episode with a bit of a whimper, as it effectively ends without any real time for suspense. Gwen winning the challenge comes out of nowhere, but it's admittedly still a bit funny nevertheless. So yeah, into the elimination, I'm not really a big fan at all. Not so much because the show captures Harold cheating and still lets it happen, which is a bit annoying, but because of the significance of Courtney's elimination. Courtney is one of, let's say, 10 main characters of the season, so it kind of stinks that her elimination comes because of a feud between two different characters. The nice moment at the end can't really save his elimination from feeling useless. Anyway, besides the elimination of Courtney and really everything with Harold this episode, the rest is pretty good. It's hard for me to ignore the ending when considering this episode, but the jokes are funny, the thriller parody is fantastic, and it's nice seeing Courtney and Duncan finally have a moment. Episode 13, X-Treme Torture. The campers are challenged to participate in an extreme sports challenge. Welcome to the last episode featuring the Gophers and Bath. Unfortunately though, this episode doesn't really focus on the teams as much as it focuses on the 3 relationships left in the show. I'll talk about that later, but first let's talk about the first 2 challenges. Both of the challenges, the moose and the skydiving, both have the same core flaw. They just aren't that fun to watch. The skydiving is animated pretty lazily with little to no gimmick at all, and the moose ride is intentionally shown in the background, albeit as a fairly humorous gag. The little emphasis put on the challenge portion of the episode is of course because of the main plot throughout, the mystery love poem and the feud that follows it. The feud itself is definitely inherently flawed a bit. Bridget should know that Jeff obviously didn't write her illegible poem, but it's still a pretty decent plot between characters that usually never interact. Watching each character slowly learn the poem wasn't meant for them is done fairly well, and the complete disregard for the idea that it could be Harold isn't too bad of a giveaway for the twist. I'll get back to the finale of the plot in a second, but first let's talk about the final challenge, the Extreme Sea-Doo Water Ski Challenge. Despite the entirety of the episode focusing on Bridget and Gwen before this challenge actually gives some attention to 4 different campers. First up is Harold and Heather. Once again, the rules of this challenge barely make sense, but it still leads to a very memorable moment in the show. I think choosing Heather for this works really well, and the whole moment is so out of left field that it ends up just being really funny. Not nearly as funny as the censoring that CN tried to do though.
Booyah!
Lindsay also somehow gets an actual moment in this episode. It's not really focused on a ton, but Lindsay suddenly becoming a strong contender after the promise of a shower is predictable, but still funny. Harold going any further than this point would not have been ideal, especially after the events of the last elimination, so I'm glad they eliminated him with little fanfare. His moment with Lashana afterwards is so beautifully awkward too, and just feels like the culmination of Harold's time on the island. Everyone's reaction to Harold's claim is also great. Lashana trying to attack Heather at the end is a bit out of nowhere, but it still works comedically for an end scene. And yeah, that's the episode. It's a pretty great one, filled with unique character dynamics and a fun conclusion. The weak challenges and the slow pace in the middle hurt it a bit, but it's still a fun last episode with the killer bass and the screaming gophers. Episode 14, Brunch of Disgustingness. The remaining campers are divided into teams of boys and girls for an eating contest. Okay, before starting this review, just so I don't have to acknowledge it throughout, this episode definitely emanates some sexist attitudes. While the episode kind of fakes taking the moral high ground, it definitely ends up following the ideas of, as Bridget says, was.
About how well guys get along and how catty girls can be.
It definitely could be worse, as the guys end up winning the challenge for a different reason, but it definitely feels a bit 2007. Anyway, into the actual episode, the challenge doesn't start until about 10 minutes in, giving the teams for the episode some time to settle. Given how the teams have started to quickly break down gender-wise anyway, only 3 campers actually have to move cabins. Trent and Owen quickly enter the group in a pretty funny and quick scene, as Bridget has a rougher time integrating with the Gophers. One thing I really don't like about the whole split cabin part of the episode is how they treat Gwen and Heather. I'm not saying they radically change each character or anything, but both seem a little dumbed down and dramatized in order to add some comedy to the scene. Anyway, this scene does drag on a bit, so to keep this review from doing the same, let's move on to the actual brunch. It's a bit messy, both literally and in a plot sense. To start with the former, as I mentioned before, I'm not really a huge fan of gross out scenes. Honestly, the show's art style more or less keeps it from ever being turn your head gross, but watching characters puke on one another makes me wonder about the person putting these scenes into the show. Anyway, into the latter, the team seemingly switch strength every round just to keep it tied. Like, no round is ever close, it's girls work together, boys work together, girls work together, boys work together. The actual moments between teams range from hilarious, like Trent getting force-fed, to, like Bridget's meditation and funnel. Anyway, it's obviously all meant to just keep it tied before the finale. The dolphin hot dogs being the final course feels very convenient and very anticlimactic. Like, it's clearly the least gross thing offered, and Chris doesn't even make a comment about his connection to Bridge. All of it coming down to Owen downing cockroach cocktails also feels like a letdown and the departure from the team nature of the episode. And besides another Jeff and Bridget moment, that's it. This one's a bit of a head scratcher. On one hand, it has some funny moments, some great character dynamics, and the break nature of it fits the season well. On the other hand, it's very anticlimactic, harbors some sexist sentiments, it is an episode full of gross out. So while the cons do outweigh the pros, it's not a terrible episode, just not a good one either. Episode 15, No Pain, No Game. The teams are officially dissolved, leaving each and every camper to look out for number 1. 2 returning campers that were eliminated return to the game. The episode starting off with tension from the girls is a great opener, especially in comparison to the jolly guys. Watching the guys immediately dissociate as soon as the teams do is also really funny, and the entire opening scene really feels like the show really understanding the characters. Anyway, unlike the next 2 seasons, this season tends to dislike not eliminating campers, so we get 2 returnees, Izzy and Eva. I wish they had some kind of reason for this, but I don't really mind these being the characters to return. Personally, I would have gone Courtney and Izzy and say that Izzy never technically got eliminated and Courtney got cheated, but whatever. Eva's actual return is animated really well, and for only being around for an episode, I think making her objective to get back at the last remaining female bass was a good call. Anyway, once again, this challenge has some structural flaws. Punishing someone for not complaining but giving them a chance to be eliminated doesn't really seem like it would make sense. I believe they did this just so that Eva and Izzy could still get eliminated, as it would feel weird for one of them to chicken out, but it's still definitely a bit odd. But other than that, it's a fun challenge. Each torture is fairly fun to watch, and they surprisingly avoid going for gross outs. The episode puts a surprising amount of emphasis on the challenge, and yeah, it pans out. It's overall a pretty great challenge. One really odd moment in this episode was Trent and Gwen's conversation. Despite showing no signs of disagreement, even coming closer together, Gwen still says that she's upset about the events of Phobia Factor 8 episodes ago. It comes out of nowhere and gets resolved rather quickly too. I guess it's just another example of miscommunication among the writers. Anyway, the ending is climatic once you stop questioning how Eva could lose from Lashana surviving. Lashana is rarely given the spotlight, so it's nice that she gets an episode before the end. Everyone's votes getting revealed at the end is also a nice way to add some flair to an otherwise obvious elimination. So yeah, this episode, while it definitely does have some issues, is still pretty good. Reintroducing and eliminating the same character makes it a pretty unimportant one, but it's a nice breather nevertheless. Episode 16, Search and Do Not Destroy. Arr, mateys. This week the Camp Scallywags set on a ye old scavenger hunt for treasure challenge. For starters, this is yet again another great challenge. They've actually gotten consistently better once we've started moving towards the end, and this one is no exception. Chris's pirate getup is pretty funny, and it gives each camper something to do while the main plot is going on. Speaking of which, this episode features the last part, besides the finale, of the Gwen Trent arc, an arc I've been pretty critical of. Yet here it makes for one of the best episodes yet. More on that later, but let's first talk about the individual challenges. They're all pretty good, but Heather's obviously stands out. The slow motion is self-aware in how cliche it truly is, but it still makes for a great Heather moment, the first of many in this episode. Trent and Gwen finally kissing is built up too well, and definitely sets the scene well for their downfall later in the episode. Izzy's sudden insertion into the alliance is honestly really funny, although it's probably just another confusion moment among the writers. Heather's plan to break up Gwen and Trent is actually really fun to watch unfold. Don't get me wrong, it's no death note, but watching Heather's relatively complicated plan work perfectly to get Trent and Gwen to hate each other is fantastic. fantastic. Lashana being the one to spread the word to get Trent sent home works well to set up a great moment down the line, but I'll get to that in a moment. First, we gotta talk about the campers using their keys. Heather getting saved because of a 1-11 chance is a little bit too lucky for the show to play it off as Heather's genius, but if you aren't paying attention, it's still a sick scene. Trent's elimination being shown suddenly fits it happening to Trent suddenly, and Lashana being the one to get Trent eliminated makes this line work as one of the best in the season.
You know, even after all this, I still didn't vote you off.
The delivery and writing on this line is superb, even if the animation ruins the clip a bit. Gwen and Trent arguably have the strongest connection of any of the couples in the show, and that makes Heather's plan even better. So yeah, overall this episode is fantastic. The challenge is fun, and there are a few great gags, and Heather's plan to break up the only other, quote, alliance really takes the spotlight and runs with it. This episode is a real standout, despite some minor goofs along the way. Episode 17, Hide and Be Sneaky. The campers are in for an old-fashioned game of hide and seek with Chef Hatchet. This episode does something very odd, as it devotes a large portion of the episode to the following episode's plot. In a very non-total drama move, the writers apparently thought that Lindsay standing up to Heather needed an episode of setup before. I get this is now the longest running season plotline since Trent's departure, but it could probably only be settled in a single episode. Jokes about Lindsay's intelligence can only be funny so many times, and Heather's complete disregard for a free vote each week is pretty uncharacteristic too. Perhaps they included the extended look of the most prominent alliance of the season because of the newly formed Guys Alliance, but more on that later. First, let's talk about the challenge of this episode. It's again a pretty good challenge that gives each character something to do. Chef challenges are usually pretty fun, and Izzy's dominance at it is fantastic as well. Izzy's small fight with Chef in the middle of the episode is a fun distraction from the Lindsay-Heather nonsense, and is surprisingly well choreographed for the show. Of course, the challenge can't actually be simple, as, despite the rules of the game, no campers besides Heather make any attempt to catch someone, and Lashana wins by making it to home base despite never actually being spotted. Lashana getting invincibility is seemingly done at random, and I think giving it to Izzy would have made more sense, but whatever. The challenge is mostly in the background to what end up being the two most important alliances of the show. The formation of the Guys Alliance is actually done really well, as instead of going the easy route of making the sensitive DJ be apprehensive, they focus on Owen and Jeff's relationships. Unfortunately, this is the only episode where the Guys Alliance does anything, as their dynamic is actually really interesting, especially Duncan's leadership. Anyway, the elimination of Bridget more or less feels like they just wanted to get rid of her. The math checks out to 3 votes for Owen, 3 votes for Duncan, and 3 votes for Bridget if you believe that Jeff didn't actually vote her off. Now I get the interpretation that Jeff was just lying to save face, but him getting tied up afterwards does not imply that at all. I also don't really like them interrupting Bridget and Jeff's goodbyes for a gag, although the relationship ends up being one of the most prominent in the series. Overall, this episode is pretty weak. The challenge is neat but not focused on, the Guys Alliance starts off strong but ends pretty weakly, and the focus on Heather and Lindsay is an episode early. Although there are some funny gags and nice moments, not much else is going for this episode. Episode 18, That's Off the Chain. The campers are challenged to compete in the Tour de Wawanakwa, where they must not only race a treacherous motocross course, but build their own bicycles using supplies from the Arts and Craft Lodge. At this point in the series, you begin to run into one of Island's biggest issues. Heather cannot be eliminated even though everyone hates her. Because everyone hates Heather, each episode either has to have no voting ceremony at all, or have a likable character be eliminated for some made-up reason. It almost always goes off, and this episode is no exception. More on that later, but let's first talk about the challenge. Again, as you could probably guess, this challenge is really sick on paper, but ends up ridiculously convoluted. Before getting to this challenge's odd downfall, the assembly of the bikes is a really nice scene. Only having 9 campers allows for some actual chemistry between each character left, and it's fun watching characters like Lindsay and Owen interact. Also, Jeff wailing over Bridget's departure is honestly the funniest that character gets. Anyway, Heather getting Lindsay to build her bike is a nice way to set up the episode's story before Chris reveals that no, we can't just have a normal challenge, and there has to be something that makes no sense. There's no reason for any camper to complete the first race. I guess it's only there to get rid of some campers and fill some time, but these campers who fail to cross the finish line end up getting instant invincibility, along with Lashana and Izzy who fail to even show up. I get this is the point of Lindsay's arc this episode, that she is being treated unfairly, but come on. Would it have been that difficult to just write Heather betraying Lindsay in a normal race, or have Heather orchestrate Lindsay's elimination in some other way? Either way, it does fortunately lead to one of the most iconic scenes of the entire show. While Cartoon Network's ridiculously poorly dubbed censorship ruins it a bit, Lindsay cursing out Heather is one of the greatest moments of the first season. It's cathartic for Lindsay, the other campers, and the viewers. Everyone being upset at Lindsay's elimination is nice too, and almost makes up for her completely bogus elimination. Overall, this episode has a really strong beginning and end, but the actual challenge portion of this episode leaves a lot to be desired. Episode 19, Hook, Line, and Screamer. Chris and Chef are nowhere to be found in this spooky episode that has campers watching a horror movie about an escaped chainsaw psycho killer killer who lives in the woods. While highly exaggerated to the point of flanderization, each character really feels like they get in their moment in the opening scene. Watching the remaining campers simply watch a movie together ends up being some of the best characterization throughout the end of the season. Anyway, the challenge this time is really clever, although the fact that no one knows of the challenge does unfortunately limit it a bit. Besides the random elimination at the end of the episode, each camper has to be dumbed down a bit to believe that a convenient newspaper just happened to be hanging out with the only bag left on the dock. But whatever, it's still a great setup for the episode. First off, Izzy and Owen are fantastic here. While their relationship has been hinted at before, it fully explodes here and they use it pretty well. Owen and Izzy have great chemistry and their scenes together are some of the funniest in the season. Seriously, the gags in this episode are unmatched by anything else this season. Owen and Izzy falling off the cliff is hilarious, and the way the characters move this episode are humorously exaggerated to great effect too. I also like Chris and Chef this episode as they feel more like characters than narrators. If you're tired of me complimenting this episode, then that's tough luck because that's pretty much going to be the rest of this review. The horror movie tropes being made fun is really the first example of a complete parody in the show, and it's done really well. Watching each character being picked off one by one is just so funny, and each scenario is fantastic. I will admit this episode isn't exactly one of the strongest in the drama department, but comically this episode hits throughout. Duncan and Gwen's friendship here works really well, and I'm glad they don't really expand on it any further. Anyway, at the end of the episode, at least before the random elimination, is fantastic too. Yes, it's incredibly goofy, but letting Duncan fight the fake serial killer allows for his arc to stay true to his character, and having Gwen get rid of the real one is nice too. The episode in general is more of a quote, goofy episode this season, but it works really well. Finally, as I hinted at before, the episode eliminates DJ semi-randomly. While I would think that letting this episode eliminate nobody, as the season has one to give, would have been the better play, DJ doesn't really have any arcs left, so eliminating him isn't exactly tragic. And he is eliminated because of an actual flaw, even if it is a bit messy. But yeah, an unfortunate elimination can't keep this episode down. Intro to credits hilarity throughout this one, as Total Drama takes its first real stab at parody, something that it takes to another level next season. But as far as this episode goes, it's one of the standouts of the season, especially comedically. Episode 20, Wawanakwa Gone Wild. The campers are challenged to become game wardens and bag a beast. This episode is, well, not very good. To start off, well fun for one episode, Izzy and Owen's fight really isn't that interesting. The episode barely devotes any time to it either, just using it as a setup to introduce the challenge. Speaking of which, the challenge is actually the least problematic aspect of the episode. Sure, the lack of any of its ability from it is weird and is remarkably close to Search and Do Not Destroy, but it once again serves the purpose of letting each camper have their moment. However, the episode really starts to falter once they get into the boating house. I have no idea why, but the voice acting seemingly takes a nosedive in this episode, and the sound mixing is atrocious. Seriously, it's edited like it wants to make you uncomfortable, and the characters sound like they're reading a script. It's like this the entire episode, and I have no idea why. It's not like the writing is really that bad, it's just the way the lines are delivered. Anyway, the main plot of this episode is Heather and Duncan's alliance. This alliance barely matters, it mostly just gives these characters something to do for an episode. Besides somewhat affecting the outcome of this episode, the pairing does nothing else at all for the rest of the season. Oh well. Total Drama as a show utilizes supernatural elements rather sparingly. The show remains relatively grounded in reality, with most examples of supernatural stuff being for comedy, and almost all of it being personified animals. So in an episode all about animals, you can guess just how many of these animals aren't exactly realistic. While some examples, like the frog, are funny, other ones, like the Voltron raccoons, make the show go off the rails a bit too much. The episode is paced really poorly too, with no real climax and way too many confessionals. Gwen winning the challenge doesn't really end up mattering at all, and Izzy shooting Heather is the only part of the challenge that I really ended up enjoying. The ending sucks too, as Izzy gets eliminated for no reason. Obviously, Heather and Duncan voted for her, but at least Lashana, Gwen, Owen, and Izzy would vote for Heather, so Izzy getting the vote is entirely plot convenience. If you somehow couldn't tell, I really don't like this one. The pacing is off, the character dynamics are non-existent, and the jokes often fail comedically. Strangely bad one down the stretch. Episode 21, Trial by Tri-Arm Triathalon. The campers are paired up in teams again, only these are the most unholy alliances ever dreamt up by Chris. Before getting into this episode, I'd like to address a really odd thing that continues throughout the end of the season. Everyone referring to a vote to decide the winner. Obviously that doesn't actually happen, but everyone, including Chris, seems to believe that it will. Now, whether or not the swap was planned, or they realized that a vote would be an incredibly lame way to end a season before writing it, I don't know. What I do know is that it makes episodes like this work really poorly. Anyway, let's get into the actual episode. First off, again, this episode is filled with way too many confessionals. Some of them are really funny, like Heather and Owen thrashing each other with the other one in there with them, but usually they feel like they just exist to fill time. The challenge is a pretty fun idea and allows for some unusual pairings that end up working really well. Besides the already mentioned funny Owen-Heather stuff, Duncan and Lashana are also hilarious together. To be honest, this episode is filled with hilarious moments, like Heather referring to eliminated campers as
Winner challenged.
and Duncan saying that his limit is about 300 pounds. But obviously, the most important pairing in this episode is Gwen and Jeff. Both of these characters have little to no character moments since their partner had been voted off, and this episode both gives them an opportunity for some characterization before the end of the show. It's really fun to watch them interact, with both characters not feeling that they're in the wrong. Like, obviously Jeff is being annoying, but he's also just trying to talk to Gwen, and it's this dynamic that makes the pairing work. The last challenge is neat and all, giving some campers an opportunity to talk about eliminated ones, but the challenge ending in a draw does give the episode a feeling of uselessness to it. In addition, it would have been nice to see some lead up to Jeff's elimination. Duncan and Heather's alliance is just sitting there, so why not have them discuss getting rid of Jeff, and perhaps getting Lashana involved? Anyway, this episode is great, but too many flaws keep it from being one of the best. The pairings all work well, and the jokes are at its funniest, but the pacing is a bit off, and the confessionals are way too frequent. The ending is a little bit too sudden too. Episode 22, Haute Camp-ture. Chris visits the luxurious Playa-Day Losers to catch up with the previously eliminated campers. This episode is just really weird. Besides old synopsises showing this episode was not planned from the beginning, it's also largely purposeless until about 20 minutes in. While the next episode, and especially the aftermath specials of the next two seasons, will follow a similar trend, the episode is still largely odd in structure. Because of this, there isn't much to discuss in this episode besides the jokes. Speaking of which, the humor is at its peak this episode. So many iconic moments are within this one episode, like this.
I love being a loser. This is so much more my style.
This.
It was completely and totally uneventful.
He kissed a guy.
No, I didn't.
I could break this tie? He totally did.
And this.
Gwen is my dream girl. I'm just not her dream guy. But as long as she's happy, I'm happy.
Even besides these three fantastic gags, each of the recurring character jokes this episode are pretty funny. Zeke continuously trying to get close to Bridge, Courtney hunting down Harold, and Izzy's shenanigans all make for some nice jokes to bounce between. More on the Courtney Harold thing for a second, I really don't mind how they handle it here. If you remember from earlier in the episode, I really disliked the whole vote altering thing, but if they were going to do it and stick with it, this was the way to handle this episode. Another quick thing to mention is that they bring up the whole losers vote for the winner of the season thing again, although this time it's insinuated that the whole cast, not just those who made it post-merge, gets a vote. It's a whole messed up bang that's not really worth getting into, so let's go ahead and fast forward to the last 2 minutes of the episode, which sure are something. Okay, including this episode, there are 5 left in the show, and 4 campers still needing to be eliminated. This makes it seem obvious that you don't eliminate anyone this time around and allow the last 4 episodes to proceed as intended. Instead of this, the show decides to eliminate Lashana via a gag. The scene itself is drawn out, and although Lashana's reaction is funny, it's not worth the elimination. It feels like a cop-out to eliminate a friendly, strong competitor. Anyway, besides the sucky ending, the rest of this episode is pretty good. The gags are some of the best in the show, and well, that's about it. It's a comedy episode that's funny, so yeah, it's good. Episode 23, Camp Castaways. A torrential rainstorm washes the cabins, and Duncan, Gwen, and Heather wake up in the middle of Lake Leech with no idea where they are. Okay, I promise this is the last time I'll describe an episode as odd, at least this season. But really, this episode has no challenge, and unlike Hook, Line, and Screamer, a pretty similar episode all things considered, it's unclear how on it Chris and Jeff are. One thing this episode does excel at, and what I believe this episode serves to show off, is just how well developed these characters are. Seriously, 22 episodes into the series, and it feels like every character has developed past their stereotype and into their own. If you ask anyone what Owen, Heather, Gwen, and Duncan would do in this type of scenario, everyone would guess correctly just because of how well developed these characters truly are. Another benefit of this would be the comedy, which is again fantastic this time around. Besides the relatively simple Castaway reference, this one is jam-packed with jokes, at least in the first half. Yeah, this episode takes a bit of a nosedive around the time that Gwen and Duncan get on the raft. For this point, every character had their own little plot. Heather was lonely, Owen was insane, Gwen was freaking out, and Duncan, well, he was actually doing pretty okay. Even the Chris and Chef plot ends up being some of the best stuff from the host this entire season, with their dynamic reaching its seasonal peak. However, once plots combine, it kinda goes downhill. The off-camera confessionals are just boring, the war paint only really made sense for Owen, and the charge towards the fire really fails to be explained or turned into anything. The campfire feels like it wants to be suspenseful without taking any additional steps towards being so, and the whole episode has a feeling of uselessness to it. In addition, and I really try not to hold it against this episode, but the fact that Lashana was eliminated without any voice lines just so this episode can exist isn't exactly satisfactory. Overall, this episode is average. First half slightly above average, second half slightly below, leaving this episode right in the middle. It's got some nice moments, but just how necessary it truly was is up for debate. Episode 24, Are We There Yeti? The campers have a rude awakening, literally, when they wake up in the middle of the wilderness. Okay, I lied. This episode is actually the weirdest one this season. For starters, Chef's the sole host this time around. While he has been a host before, a completely Chris Void episode this late into the season was not something I expected from this show. For starters, I really like the attention to detail to let Chef do the recap this time. I know I haven't been mentioning them, but the jokes in the recaps are surprisingly well written for something that could easily just be a montage. Anyway, this episode's challenge is shockingly similar to the last one, although this one is actually a challenge. Chef's pretty funny throughout this episode, and the fantastic use of the 4 remaining campers that I mentioned last episode continues into this one. Gwen, Duncan, and Heather are all fantastically rude to one another this episode, and Owen continues to be some fantastic comedic relief. The teams in this episode are fine, although making this a team challenge in general is not what I would have gone for, especially considering how they end up handling it, but more on that later. While they don't serve the challenge very well, the character dynamics between each team do allow for some great moments. It's just fun watching these characters interact, as they all keep it relatively suspenseful who's going to win the challenge. The pranking montage, as you could call it, is the worst part of the episode though. Each team just stealing a single item is so strange, and the actual traps are fairly uninteresting. Wawanakwa is also not a very interesting element of the episode, more or less just slowing it down in an episode that desperately needs more time at the end. The girls warming up to the guys in order to betray them is a neat way to allow them to obtain victory, and I would have been more than pleased with that being the end of the challenge. What is disappointing is Owen losing the challenge over some "he's fat and loves food" BS. It's just a terrible moment that spits in the face of the separation from stereotypes that the season built up throughout the last 23 episodes. It's unnecessary, and while eliminating him because of his gluttony would at least make sense, they don't even do that. Speaking of which, ever since I watched this episode for the first time years ago, I have been under the impression that Chef eliminated Duncan by choice. However, on the rewatch for this review, I actually think that they had a vote to eliminate Duncan. I would really love to hear what you guys think about this in the comments, but it makes sense that Gwen and Heather would vote off the smarter, more athletic Duncan, but the whole jury thing kind of complicates that a bit. A conversation between Heather and Gwen about this decision would have been really cool, and so would a moment acknowledging Duncan and Gwen in Hook, Line, and Screamer, but whatever. This episode is yet again another pretty mediocre one. Weird stuff throughout, but nothing really offensive besides the end of the challenge, and the jokes throughout make up for it. Still, not a great ending for Duncan. Episode 25, I Triple Dog Dare You. In the semi-final round, Heather, Gwen, and Owen are forced to play a game of I Triple Dog Dare You, a twisted version of Spin the Bottle meets Truth or Dare. Well, here it is, likely the most iconic episode to come from the season. Unfortunately, it does start with a way too long confessional montage. Like, I get it, it's a fun way to see into the minds of the character, but the funniest jokes in the show are usually from character interaction. It's not just a character monologuing into a camera. Anyway, that's pretty much the only negative with this episode, as the rest is just completely fantastic. That's not to say there aren't nitpicks to be made, like the dares mostly being unrelated to their character, but the challenge for this episode is the best of the season. Just completely perfect that the eliminated campers are creating the challenge for the remaining ones. Each of the dares are fun to watch, the gross out stuff is handled surprisingly well, and they use it pretty sparingly, and Owen getting a huge lead makes sense for the character. The music is the best of the season too, as the funky jazz behind the heinous dares is completely hilarious. Obviously though, the highlight of the episode is the beautifully crafted end of Heather's game. For starters, the fact that it is Lindsay is so perfect for the plot. I honestly don't think that Total Drama as a show could suit itself seriously to give us such a perfect moment, but it's really well done. Also, and this really isn't from this episode, but while researching the video, I was reminded of the foreshadowing from That's Off the Chain, which once again blew my mind.
Hey, look! It's an ugly doll with pretty hair just like you!
Was this intentional? Maybe. Is it still great? Obviously, and the actual moment is built up to really well. Heather getting screwed by the rules is also fitting because of what happened to Lindsay, so this entire sequence is honestly the best crafted of the season. Heather's freakout is a bit cliche, but so is the entire show, so it fits fantastically. Anyway, this episode is fittingly deemed one of the classics of the series, as it shows the downfall of one of the best written characters of the season. While it does leave the finale in a tough spot, something inevitable given the dual winners nature of the show, the episode is still just fantastic. It's hilarious, uses past characters in a terrific indirect way, and gives Heather
Everything your karma owes you.
Episode 26, the last episode, really. It's the finals, and there's a surprise in store for our two remaining champs, Owen and Gwen. Finale time, and this episode begins very finale-y with a string of confessionals from the finalists about their time on the island. Does it have some nice moments? Yeah, it does. Is it also way too long for the characters to be talking to nobody? Yeah, it definitely is. While I could ramble on about small stuff in this section, like Gwen's 5 sane people list, let's go ahead and get to the challenge. This episode from the beginning has a heavy focus on Trent and Gwen. Is this a good thing? No, but I really don't know what the alternative was. To me, it seems like this plot was resolved in Trent's elimination, but they suddenly just bring it back. I guess this was just to give the characters something to talk about instead of the challenge, since Owen doesn't really have anything going on. Although technically Owen and Izzy did have an unresolved fight, but that probably wouldn't have the same dramatic flair as Gwen and Trent. Heather trying to sabotage Gwen is fine too, I guess, although it never really amounts to anything substantial. She is the main character though, so I guess that's why they gave her a plot. Seeing her and Lindsay would have been fun though. Anyway, let's actually get into the challenge. It's fine. It's not anything special, but it really doesn't need to be. Making the entire season have multiple useless plot points because they don't actually have a vote is probably worth having an actual good finale, so I'm somewhat okay with it. Would have liked to see them acknowledge it though. The vague rules about helping don't really help its case though, and the race itself is pretty dramaless until the end. Duncan and Courtney, as well as Heather and Lashana, both having small moments is well appreciated though. As you probably know, there are 2 endings to this episode, so the winner depends on where you live. Do I like this? No, absolutely not. This might actually be an unpopular opinion, but having a regional winner is not worth being unable to reference the winner in future seasons. I feel like this decision was made before action was greenlit, but nevertheless, I still watched them both. They are similarly good, with Gwen's having a better resolution to the Trent stuff and the extra benefit of Gwen throwing a party even though she's never been to one. I would have liked them to emphasize the fact that Owen is still getting some of the winnings, and having Owen fail in the exact same way as Are We There Yeti is massively lame though. Owen's ending has a nice moment at the campfire too.
I'm so psyched! This is just awesome! Yes!
To be honest, that kind of stuff is my favorite part of the finale, with the more wholesome stuff at the ends being pretty stellar. Stuff like Gwen and Heather having a nice moment after Chris is thrown in the water really emphasizes the teenager togetherness that the show has built up. Anyway, this finale is great, but not perfect. It's climatic and funny, but the Trent stuff is so boring that it's hard to consider it the best of the season. Still, it's plenty serviceable, and it's helped immensely by the fact that it doesn't end up being a series finale. Special, total, drama, island. The campers reunite for a new challenge posed by Chris. Find a suitcase filled with $1 million. I was kind of conflicted whether or not to put this with Island or Action, but at least in America it aired with the former, so that's why it's here. The beginning of the episode is really nice. It's cool to see all the campers just relaxing with each other. Some of the interactions are really neat, and the jokes are great too. Owen taking the chance at $1 million over his $100K makes sense, and while making Gwen contractually obligated to do so in her version was a good idea, it still gives the whole season a feeling of uselessness. Anyway, the gag with the campers being unable to resist the chance at $1 million is actually really funny, and the team's form both makes sense and allow for some usually unseen groupings. Alright, that's enough praise for this episode. Let's talk about the big negative this time around, the runtime. This episode is so long. At twice the average episode length, this one drags heavily throughout. Like, I get they wanted to have some extra runtime to get some attention to every character, but come on. So much time is spent on characters like Katie and Sadie that it's hard not to just roll your eyes every time there's a scene without the case. Speaking of which, they find the case for the first time 20 minutes into this episode. 20 minutes! This could be okay if the jokes were funnier throughout it, but a good chunk of them just don't land at all. Justin actually getting some lines is cool, there's an actual good gross out joke, and Izzy, Eva, and Noah are a really fun group, but does anyone really need to watch Harold try to diagnose Heather? Anyway, other things that suck this episode, the geography. I'm usually pretty lenient on the show with this kind of stuff. I haven't mentioned it once before, and it's usually incredibly inconsistent. But this time they go too far, somehow making the entire set next to a city? And putting Play-Day losers on the back of the island? I really don't get it at all, and it's honestly distracting this episode. Anyway, these 20 or so minutes in the middle are mostly mediocre, with some comedic gems hidden within. The ending does have something I really want to talk about though, which is the insane choreography of everyone getting into the water at the end. I mean, just look at this. It's easily the best animation of the season, truly stellar stuff. The reveal of season 2 is nice, and I'll save my thoughts on the 14 campers selected for the next video. Overall, this special is okay. The middle is so long, but the beginning and end are fantastic. So yeah, you can probably see the score coming. Alright, Alright, this video is already likely pushing an hour, so I won't make this terribly long. The first season is always the hardest to review as there is something to compare it to, so there really isn't that much to say. First, let's address the comedy this season. It's funny. The over-reliance on gross out gets more annoying from time to time, but there is a pretty large variety of comedic elements this season. From wild personified creatures to grounded verbal comedy to strange references to very non-kid media, this season is honestly comedically diverse. I will say, the season does get less funny by the end, mostly because of the elimination of funnier characters early on, Noah and Cody being the best examples of this. Both these characters will get much larger roles in later seasons, so it's not that big of an issue. Anyway, I largely addressed the comedy throughout the individual episode reviews, so I'll now go on to some of the more significant season arcs. Almost all of these arcs are based around a relationship, but the main one that isn't is Heather's. More specifically, her alliance with Beth and Lindsay. This arc is easily the strongest of the season, allowing Heather to become a fantastic season villain. The foreshadowing and poetic end to this one is some of the best stuff to come out of the season, and Beth's downfall is portrayed really well too. Lindsay's love of Heather just adds to how legendary this arc is. This one even intercepts with most of the other ones this season, the best example of course being the Trent-Gwen breakup. Speaking of which, it's arguably the second largest arc of this season, taking up basically entire full episodes. So is it as good? No, it's not. It's like a parody of a cheesy indie movie relationship that forgets to ever be a parody. It's just so inconsistent. They'll make up and then unmake up for the next episode for the same thing. Before getting to the last one I really want to cover, let's speed through a couple of them. Jeff and Bridget, pretty good, strange ending. Owen and Izzy, funniest couple of the season, works really well. Tyler and Lindsay, two of the funniest characters in the show, just not together. Harold and Lashana, funniest in concept, what the show obviously knows. Okay, that's all of them besides the best one, Duncan and Courtney. This relationship obviously gets cut short, but that's probably for the best. It's built up only to crumble. Now, I'm obviously not saying that this is, quote, the best couple of the show. Obviously, these characters are completely incompatible, but that's what makes it such a great story. It's a major story point in the next 2 seasons, so I'll just let it rest until then. Finally, I just want to quickly touch on a feeling that this season has, just how rough it is. And while it sounds like a complaint, it's really much more of a compliment. This season just feels uncensored and raw. While it does occasionally hurt this season, like poor audio mixing of certain episodes, sometimes it just hits a moment of realistic teenager portrayal that other seasons never quite reach. And that helps the season a bunch, as it struggles to deal with its ridiculous 22 character season, 24 if you count the hosts. I have more to say about this season in the series overview and in comparison to other seasons down the road, so I'll just leave you with a rating. 7 out of 10. Definitely a solid first outing with only a few episodes and arcs that drag it down. Least favorite episode was Wawanakwa Gone Wild, and while I almost went with Seek and Do Not Destroy, my favorite was I Triple Dog Dare You. Well, I think that's pretty much it besides some shameless plugs. If you want to see me review action within the next month or two, go ahead and subscribe. If you want to read my trash opinions instead of hearing them, then follow me on Twitter. I usually announce what I'm working on and release dates and junk over there. Well, that's pretty much it. This has been Apple Samuel, and I'll see you for total drama action, but probably a few smaller videos before then. Thanks for watching.